the program on the environment at the University of Washington. My name is Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator tonight. Tonight's topic, of course, is Pacific Northwest up in smoke, wildfires, forests, and climate change. Without further ado, I would like to get started with our presentations tonight. We're going to start with our presentations from our panel, then we're going to have a moderated discussion up front here, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience. After we do that for a little bit, we're going to invite our scientists out into the audience to mingle among you and to answer your questions individually. So, if you have questions you want to ask one-on-one with a scientist, if you actually want to talk directly to a scientist, you will have your chance as well. So let me introduce our very first panelist tonight, Brian Harvey. Dr. Brian Harvey is faculty in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. Brian has a Ph.D. in biology from the University of Wisconsin, a master's degree in geography from San Francisco State University. And prior to coming to UW, Brian was a David H. Smith postdoctoral conservation science fellow at the University of Colorado Boulder. Brian conducts research on forests, fires, insect outbreaks, and how forests respond to disturbance and warming climate throughout the northwestern U.S. His research informs forest management in the fire-prone forests we all know and love, those that are part of our identity in the West. He also teaches courses in forest ecology, landscape ecology, and forest disturbances at UW. In his spare time, because he does have a little bit of spare time, maybe just a tiny bit after all that, he enjoys exploring all the Pacific Northwest has to offer, spending time with his family, and chasing his 3-year-old son around. So without further ado, let us bring Brian Harvey to the stage.
Thanks for the introduction, Sean, and for the opportunity to talk a little bit about forest fires, forest ecology, and the science behind what's going on in our woods in Washington and the Pacific Northwest more broadly. So, we all know the saying, where there's smoke, there's fire. I'm calling this little intro talk, where there's forests, there's fire, a lot of the time, not all the time. And where there's fire, there's smoke. Obviously, a lot of the attention from the last summer and few summers of forest fires has been drawn out by the fact that smoke has caused some pretty big problems in high population centers. But I'm gonna sort of back us away from the smoke a little bit and talk about the forest ecology and fire ecology behind that, and then hopefully open that up to some questions that folks have in the discussion piece of this. Okay, we can go. Okay, so let's take a quick whirlwind tour of some of the more memorable activities around fire in the Pacific Northwest and the western half of North America more broadly. Anybody recognize that picture in July of 2015 about a particularly interesting fire event that happened in summer of 2015? That's actually in the coastal temperate rainforest in Olympic National Park up the Queets River drainage in what was a particularly interesting and rare fire event in 2015. A lot of folks probably remember 2015 as the year that it seemed like eastern Washington was on fire, but there were some really interesting fires happening in places where they very rarely occur that summer as well, including in the coastal temperate rainforest in Olympic National Park. September 2017, last year, this is the Eagle Creek Fire, which burned on the Columbia River Gorge in forests that are in a very heavily used recreation area, the Columbia River Gorge, and blew smoke into Portland and caused a lot of air quality problems in Portland last summer. That was last summer. December 2017, the holidays. Southern California had a fire ripping through just an area just north of Los Angeles in what was, up until recently, the largest wildfire in California's recent history. Is this microphone even working anymore? What's going on? It's being worked on. Awesome. Thanks. Okay, so yeah, December 2017, largest wildfire in California's history, eclipsed already by fires this summer in California. And then again, most recently, the smoke in Seattle being off the charts and being some of the worst air quality in any major urban area in the world this summer, bringing a lot of attention to this problem. And so we click this really quick. That's all recent stuff, and I think we get this idea in our mind that we're seeing things that we've never seen before on the planet. And I think it is really quick and important to quick bring this back to, this isn't the first time that we've seen fires like this. There's definitely some interesting components of what's going on right now. But fires, much like the ones that we've been seeing, are not a novel thing in a lot of our ecosystems. And in fact, this is a picture following the Big Burn in 1910, which was a big, widespread period of fire in this part of the world. We've seen other large fires in forests around here. And so the things that we're seeing right now are interesting, challenging, and novel in some ways, but not like we're learning for the first time that fire is an important part of these ecosystems. And so I'm going to talk us a little bit through some of that in a second here. So click on that. So right now, with everything going on, it's on a lot of people's minds of why is this happening? What's the cause of this? What's to blame for this? And how can we fix this? And so that's a really important societal conversation that we need to have. But one of my hopes as a scientist is that conversation is informed by the best science that we have about this. And then we can use that as a foundation upon which to start thinking about what we might want to do about it as a society. But let's think about this, because why this is happening is really important to first sort of deconstruct. Is climate warming driving these trends? This is something that you hear a lot in a lot of the dialogue. And there's a lot of work that suggests that climate is one of the key drivers behind these trends. We know in the past paleo record, as well as in the contemporary record, that climate has a very clear correlation with wildfire activity. And there are really good reasons behind that, because climate is one of the key drivers of wildfire activity. This is some work by Leroy Westerling, who's a scientist at UC Merced. And this was actually a really important piece of work, because it was one of the first pieces in recent history that had looked at the correlation between large wildfires, which are the bars that we're seeing in red there, in the western US, and then the temperature anomaly in black there. And you see that they're very highly correlated. This is in the empirical record of recent history, but it's also very important to recognize that this is also predicted to increase in the future. The trends that we've seen right now are probably a glimpse of what we're going to be seeing in the future. So, yes, climate warming is one piece of the puzzle in these trends, and so I think that's important to consider. Another thing that gets talked about quite a bit is past forest management part of this, and sometimes that gets a lot of the causal blame for the recent trends that we're seeing. And here are two illustrative pictures taken from the same spot in Idaho in 1909, prior to our effective fire suppression that we've placed on a lot of forests throughout the western half of North America. And then here's that same shot in 1979. Anything different? Very clear differences in the fuel structure there. And so past forest management, whether that's been through things that we've done on the ground or from actively suppressing fires or excluding fires from a lot of landscapes, as well as other things like grazing and logging and other changes that have happened due to past forest management, is one piece of the puzzle, certainly, that has led to some of the challenges that we're now seeing with wildfires in forests. So I have a question for the audience. Actually, it's a two-part question, or I'll ask the question twice, just to kind of test our lens and focus on this. So a lot of us have heard about these dialogues in the past, right? And you've probably seen pictures like the ones I just showed. I want to just get some quick ideas of, do folks think that this looks like a healthy forest with a restored natural fire regime and fire risk that is not uncharacteristically severe? Meaning, if fire went through here, does this look like an overgrown, unhealthy forest, or something that might actually be able to take fire and not be catastrophic? Okay, this one's got a pretty good chance, right? Meaning, the answer to that question is probably yes, right? Sorry, I have some double negatives in there, which I realize is not right. It's a good way to confuse people and sound smarter than you really are. But, yeah, this has a good chance of experiencing fire and not being catastrophic, right? Correct. The structure here, I think, is well set up for fire going through and acting naturally how it always did, and probably not being catastrophically severe. Next slide. How about this one right here? No. And why would you say no? This is now a 1 year post-fire picture. The other one was 3 years post-fire. Everything's toasted, right? And that's a pretty dense forest. Well, as you probably guessed, it's a trick question. In fact, it's the same exact answer right here, because this forest is adapted to severe fire. And so that last picture was a picture on the east side of the Cascades in dry ponderosa pine forest that historically experienced frequent fire on the order of every few years to decades. This is actually a picture of a different forest ecosystem, in fact, on the west side of the Cascades, that is built to and well adapted to very infrequent but severe and large fires when they do occur. And so if we go to my final slide, just as sort of a placeholder for things that I'd be happy to further answer some questions about, I think it's really, really, really important when we're talking about wildfire and the role that climate may play in terms of changing wildfire activity and what that means from a forest ecology perspective, or our ecosystems, is context really matters. And in drier, what we call in the fire ecology world fuel limited systems, meaning fire came through so quickly that it sort of kept those fuels at bay, we've suppressed fire and effectively raised that fuel limit now to where there was never really a climate conditions limit on fire in these systems, because they occur in warm, dry areas, but historically they would have been fuel limited by frequent fire. We've now lifted that, and now that they're overgrown in a lot of areas, that's a challenging context. However, there are a lot of areas where fires historically were very infrequent and severe, and were never fuel limited because they only burned during the climate conditions or weather conditions that were conducive to fire spread. And so in those conditions, the challenges that we face in terms of management options and how we might want to think about those as a society are very different than these fuel limited systems here, because reducing the fuels in these systems is not going to have the same impact as it is here. The effect of climate change in these systems is probably going to be different than it is in these systems over here. And so when we think about chaparral in California, western Cascade, higher elevation forests that burn with stand replacing severe fires, it's really important to realize that that's kind of a different beast than these frequent fire forests, where fuels reduction management is probably going to make a big impact on setting forests up for a better future under a warming climate. So, if we go to the final slide before I pass it off here, if we kind of take that opening line of where there's forest, there's fire, and where there's fire, there's smoke, a warming climate is likely to present some key challenges for forests, fire, and people, and the context is really going to matter when we think about how we might want to move forward with management solutions in a lot of these areas. And the people part of it is a good segue into our next esteemed speakers here. So I'll pass it over to Heidi's next. All right, awesome. All right. I'm gonna put this microphone down and you have to choose the right microphone.
Mix them up.
All right, let's hear it for Brian one more time. All right, just moving on now. We've heard a lot about forests and wildfires and the connection there. We're going to move right into talking with someone who has some experience with climate science research. This is Dr. Heidi Roop. She's a lead scientist for science communication at the University of Washington's Climate Impact Group and an adjunct research fellow at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Heidi works to strengthen the communication of the connection between climate science and decision making across a range of sectors and government agencies at local, state, and federal levels. Heidi designs trainings and communication resources that work to increase climate resilience across the United States and abroad. She also conducts research on how to use communications and the process of knowledge co-production to advance climate-smart decision-making. Her climate research focuses on understanding the variability in precipitation in alpine and polar environments. Heidi holds a Ph.D. in geology with an emphasis on climate change. So let's give it up for Heidi Roop.
Next slide, please. So Brian gave me a great segue, which is that tonight I'm here to talk to you as a resident of Seattle, as someone who thinks and is concerned about future climate, who shares the air that we all breathe, now here in Seattle, in the state of Washington, and around the world, and to talk about and think about whether it is the fact that we all share the same burden when we experience some of the negative consequences of climate change. And I'll steal my own thunder, and I'll say that the answer is no, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so we're going to explore that a bit, but I'm going to first sort of back up and revisit some of the climate science information. So I work at the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group. As my bio alluded, we deliver a lot of science to decision makers around the Pacific Northwest region. That's anywhere from a range of tribal nations to the governor's office to our state agencies who are responsible for monitoring the quality of the air that we're breathing, designing the roads that we drive on, and the many, many, many parts of our daily lives that we take advantage of every day that will be touched by or are already being touched by a changing climate system. Next slide, please. So this is a synthesis statement from the National Climate Assessment, which is a U.S. Synthesis of the best available science for a region. There will be a new assessment published shortly. This is from 2014. But one of the key takeaways for our region here in the Northwest is that climate change will alter Northwest forests. I think Brian made a convincing argument for that. And that there are nuances, and those nuances matter, right? We are in store for insects and disease outbreaks, and we're forcing longer-term shifts in forest types and species, right? This is, I would argue, a bit jargon-laden, and I think points to the bigger question is, why do we care about climate? More importantly, what can we do? So in the face of those things, what does one do? Well, we try to look towards the future. Next slide, please. And the future doesn't look so bright in terms of thinking about forest health and wildfire. By the 2080s, the median area burned by wildfires, that's the area of forest, we talk about it in acres. I was thinking about, well, what's an acre? And I kind of have conceptually an idea. But apparently a football field, if you take away the end zones, is an acre-ish, minus a few percent, so imagine that. In the Northwest could be more than double relative to 1916 to 2006. Again, a bit of jargon, but in all of our future scenarios, we expect more and bigger wildfires in the Northwest. Next slide, please. So this is a loop of a satellite image that was taken this year on the 20th of August. You can see the wildfire smoke swirling around our region. You can also see the smoke be delivered from the Cougar Creek fire and travel around. It's quite mesmerizing. But I'm going to stop here in this mesmerizing loop with a bit of a personal story, right? Is that as I started, that so we all share the air. For those of us who are in Seattle or Washington or the greater Western region, or even on the East Coast this summer, we were breathing the smoke that was produced from wildfires in the US and in Canada. And that smoke travels quite quickly and long distances. And that impacts all of us, right? I happen to be an asthmatic. I like to bike commute to work. Sometimes those things don't intermix. That's not actually a terrible burden, but I think, being stuck with your in-laws is perhaps a burden. That would be, yeah, I feel you. I don't think my in-laws are watching. This isn't being live streamed, so yes, I'm with you. Right, but not to make light of it. I've spent most of my career as an earth scientist, physical scientist, thinking about how past climate changes and what that means for the future, thinking about precipitation. And now I find myself looking towards the future, but thinking about what is that we do now, and having hard conversations with myself, but also with decision makers, people that we all in this room hold accountable for helping to shape the future that we all want, right? And I don't know that this is the future that I want. Actually, I do know this isn't really the future I want. It might be the future I get, and I'm realistic about that. But the question is, are we prepared? And are we preparing in a way that ensures that we are living the best, most equitable, and resilient way we can? Are we thriving? Are all of our communities here in Washington State thriving, right? That is a fundamental question. And that, in fact, is a choice. Next slide, please. And it turns out that smoke travels fast. There was that loop, right? And we were all breathing it, those of us who are here. And the smoke doesn't need a passport. And so the next speaker will talk about the implications of smoke, right? It doesn't, my husband told me to tell this joke, and I'm going to do it now just to make him happy. Smoke doesn't need, smoke has a nexus pass. Wah, wah. Right, so this summer, right, we were surrounded by fire. It's not just fire burning in Washington, it's fires burning in British Columbia, which happens to be another nation, if you didn't notice, which means when we start talking about policy, it matters. This is an international issue that touches all of us. Next slide, please. So the question is, it's an international issue, it's complicated. The future is going to bring more and bigger fires. This is a quote from a piece in the National Geographic that was published this August, featuring a range of scientists from around the country and in the Northwest. And I'm going to read it because I think it's important. Hospitals have seen an uptick in respiratory complaints. Fair. I'm pretty sure that's true. Pools closed. Bummer. Soccer practices were canceled. And apple pickers on the eastern slopes of the Cascade Mountains were encouraged to wear masks when they were able to work at all. And I think this paragraph for me is incredibly illuminating, right? I just said it's inconvenient because I didn't get to bike to work. There are serious implications when we think about the consequences of climate change, not only in our personal lives, but in this paragraph demonstrates that it's not only inconvenient for when we want to recreate outside, it has serious implications for where you live and where you work. People's employment and lives are threatened by climate change. And that is complicated and also unfortunate, and I think we all have a role to play in developing solutions, and it points to the need for well thought out, well crafted, equitable solutions to climate change. Next slide, thank you. And I'm not going to belabor the point because I'm sure I'm running short on time, but the way that we describe this in sort of academic community and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we were all exposed, if you live in Seattle, I'm using the royal we because I'm pretending you were all here and you all were breathing the smoke. We were all exposed to the wildfire smoke. In the future, there will be more and bigger wildfires. We theoretically will be exposed to smoke. But how well we cope or respond, or the extent to which we're vulnerable to those impacts, differs. And there are key ways in which that differs. So where you live and where you work can make you more vulnerable to the consequences of climate change, not just the air that you breathe. But again, there are a range of impacts that we're expecting. Fire is one of them, floods is one of them, extreme heat is another. And so where you live and where you work have really meaningful consequences for how you will feel and what your lived experience is of climate change. And next slide. And this is going to cue us up. In fact, it's a quote from our next speaker, clever me, which I think is actually sort of my central tenet moving forward and a space in which I work, but also where I find hope, which is that we need to adapt to climate change, right? We need solutions. Those are individual actions, and I would argue importantly, those are well-crafted, equitable, informed policies that use science and that plan for a future and choose for planning for that future now and adapting for that now, because that will cost money, that does require political will. But we also have to mitigate the root causes. And that is the fact that we continue to emit greenhouse gases, carbon and methane among them. And well-crafted, smart policies need to account for both of those. And they need to account for the ways in which we will experience climate differently depending on who we are. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Nives.
All right, thank you so much, Heidi. That was great food for thought. Just one little quick announcement, y'all. We have King 5 here, and they're filming just a little bit of news on, reporting on the group that we have here tonight, people who are interested in wildfires and taking action around climate change. So they're going to go ahead and set up and just do a brief little intro behind me. That's what they're doing. Don't look directly at the camera. No, just kidding. If you have any warrants out for your arrest, you might want to turn your head. But I do want to introduce our next speaker right now. Our next speaker is Nives Dolsak. She's the Associate Director of the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington, where she teaches courses on climate governance, among other topics. She received her joint Ph.D. Wow, that's bright. I like that. I was holding this up so I can see. She received her joint Ph.D. from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs and the Department of Political Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. Nives' research examines institutional challenges in governing common pool resources, and she's authored 2 books on that topic. Additionally, she publishes in leading journals of environmental studies, public policy, legal studies, and nonprofits. You may know her work from articles in the Washington Post, The Hill, Slate, HuffPost, The Conversation, Regulatory Review, and Open Democracy. There's pretty much no place she hasn't published, which is a little intimidating for me, actually. Nives serves on the science panel of the Puget Sound Partnership. She is the recipient of the University of Washington's College of the Environment Outstanding Community Impact Award in 2018 and the Outstanding Teaching Faculty Award in 2013. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Nives to the stage.
Thank you. Does this sound okay? I come from the part of the world where beer gardens are used for drinking, and if there's any audio, it's usually an accordion. So this is why I came to United States. It's the only country where they have science in breweries. Could you advance, please? Next slide. And by the way, no more beautiful slides. Heidi's slide was the most beautiful slide that had my name on it. And can I please have a copy of that? A lot of what I'll be talking about today, and if I run out of time, please look up the article that I published with Asim Prakash in The Hill on this very issue. If you don't find it on The Hill, I am the only Nives at UW. So there's going to be no challenges in finding my publications at the UW homepage. Just Google UW Nives, you'll find me. Anyway, so this was the article that Sean mentioned. Seattle smoky summers are becoming the new normal, and if that is indeed the case, what can we do about it? I'm a scientist, but I'm a social scientist. I study societies and how we respond to environmental issues like forest fires, climate change, and others. Next slide, please. Okay, those of you who are from Seattle, you're completely ignorant about this. You never had to worry about this. If you're from California, you know it very well. You get it with your mother's milk. What this is air quality index. What it tells you is that green's okay if it's yellow and you have asthma. I'm very sorry to hear that. You don't want to be outdoors if it's orange. You definitely don't want to be outdoors if you're 50 plus and so on. If it's red, look for a different country, okay? And we in Seattle, we're not used to seeing these numbers, but in August 21, I don't have a map, but I thought I'll give you a number. Actually, I do have a map. But first, sorry, let me just go back to the numbers. Those those are the numbers from end of August. They're all in red. They're over 180, 170. That's not what we're used to in Seattle, okay? Air quality index in Seattle, we usually get 40, 25, not 170. My son woke up and exited the door and he said, he smelled and he said, this smells like Delhi, India. And he was absolutely right, because this is how Delhi smells in December when they're burning their rice paddies. Okay, it's organic matter burning, and that's what we had in Seattle. So those are the numbers where you don't want to be residing. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, a map we're not used to seeing. Those red dots are really poor air quality index areas. And we in the Pacific Northwest, we love the outdoors, we love the clean air. We're not used to red dots. So my question is, what are we going to do about those red dots? Next slide, please. I know you may think that it's not important. I know you may be fed up with the question of who done it. But in public policy, we do have this question, and we have to take it very seriously. So on the one hand, we had Secretary Zinke, who claimed that what we were experiencing is because of bad forest management. On the other hand, we had Washington governor who was attributing fires to climate change. And what we're doing is we're staying indoors, with or without in-laws, and saying, we just want this to be resolved. We don't care who's done it. As a social scientist, I have to tell you, we do care about who's done it, because that question provides answer to two important issues. One is, if we know who's done it, then we know whose behavior has to change. And if they cannot change behavior, they at least need to pay for it. Okay? Because not everyone can change behavior, but we can. Thank you. You like the paying for it, right? So, a natural scientist will probably not give you or me or us an answer where they would say, well, partial regression coefficient that explains the responsibility of climate versus the poor fuel management is this. We're not going to get that. So the question is, without that information, what can we do? Next slide, please. What can we do about it in Washington? I know you must be wondering, what was she thinking when she put this up? You can obviously not read what's on the left side of the screen, but what it is a part of the Initiative 1631 that specifies that 25% of the revenue that would be generated if 1631 were to pass, the 25% of that revenue would go towards clean waters and healthy forests. So we've not decided yet who's done it, yet we're generating funds. If 1631 were to pass, we would generate funds that would provide some funds to address the issues of healthy forests. So that's what's on the left, and you can obviously read in detail about 1631. On the right-hand side, just a reminder, we're already doing a lot about it. I have just picked up one agency, and that is the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. If you look at their wildfire information, you're going to see that they're working hard on industrial fire precaution levels. They're working hard on educating communities, working with communities to write plans that will help them adapt and adjust and respond when needed. They're providing information, they're setting up the information and alert systems. So we are working a lot on these issues in Washington State. The problem is not that many fires were from Washington State. So next slide, please. What do we do about fires in British Columbia, Oregon, and California? So my last slide here has 3 sections. The top section is what can governments, plural, do? What can environmental NGOs do? And we have many of them here today. They're all active on these issues. So if you would please help me and give them a hand, thanking them for what you're doing. And I also want to point out the industry has to play a role. Okay? So let me go through these points. First, governments. On the right-hand side, I have a slide. I did not create it, but I'm using a slide that's from probably Department of Interior, showing the ownership of forests on the west coast. The dark green is national forest, the lighter green is state forests. What I'm trying to say is there's a lot of government-owned forests. And obviously there, the precautions are being, the policies are being adopted, policies are changing. One more thing that I want to highlight is air pollution. We have in United States policies where we have addressed air pollution that's coming from one state to another state. In the east, on the east coast, there is something what we call ozone transport region, where the air pollution is coming from the Midwest and moving to the Northeast. EPA has put in place, and the Congress has put in place, a system that allows those states to work one with another to develop systems for reducing the pollution that then crosses state boundaries. So in the United States, we've learned how to address these cross-state transboundary issues. We do have examples, we know how to do it. Of course, there's also challenges. The upwind states don't want to be a part of the region, and that issue is not being yet resolved. But we do have institutional precedent, if you want, to address cross-state transboundary pollution issues, air pollution issues. Another institutional issue that is beginning to be addressed is how do we pay for fire disasters. In the past, we were borrowing from Peter to paying Paul, essentially taking funds from regular management to pay for disaster. What we need is a separate disaster funding, which we don't yet have for forests at the national level. So that's another solution that we have to work on. Another thing that we have to start talking about is cross-state cost sharing. Can we in Washington, if we're really upset about forests in Oregon, BC, and California, help them keep those fires down? Are we willing to pay? Are we willing to cost share and help them suppress those fires and control those fires? So those are the government side issues. Environmental NGO side issues. One issue that I'd like to point out as a social scientist is that we may have a conflict, we will likely have to resolve a conflict, when on one hand we will have the Endangered Species Act and protection of endangered species, on the other hand we will have fire suppression. And we will have to have very serious conversations. Are we willing to give up maybe something on the Endangered Species Act to help with fire control and fire suppression? That's an open question. I'm not saying one way or the other, but it will be a question that will come up, and we, the society, will have to answer it. Industry. Industry has worked carefully within itself and developed best forest practices. Industry has worked with environmental NGOs and has developed even better forest practices. We can look for solutions in those same best practices. They already have standards for how to handle forest management. They already have standards on how to address fire in a forest. We can go back to those, we can modify those, industry can modify those, and we as consumers can reward the industry that's incorporating fire adaptation into more stringent forestry practices. So this is my last slide, and I'm excited to hear questions from the audience. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much for this. That was phenomenal. That was really good. Well, so at this point, I'm going to ask our panelists to come up. I'm going to ask our panelists to come up front and take seats up here so we can have a little discussion. So why don't you please join me up front. And while they're doing that, I just want to make a couple of brief announcements and also let you know that if you have questions that you want our panelists to answer right now as part of our Q&A, please fill out your comment cards, little index cards. Put your questions down on paper and pass those to the end of your row. We'll have some volunteers go around and fill and pick those up. We'll make sure that your questions get answered. You can wave them in the air if you want. Wave them in the air like you really do care. And we'll pick those up and we'll make sure that your questions get answered by our panelists. Just want to make one quick plug for Cascadia Climate Action before we go any further. Cascadia Climate Action, the website is right there. Cascadia Climate Action, as you might suspect, is all about action. The idea is to engage you all to address issues related to climate change. And I really encourage you all to check out the website and learn about some more things that you can do to engage in the issue of climate change. The Cascadia Climate Action website has a lot of different options for you to pursue, ways that you can engage directly by lobbying elected officials, by commenting on projects, and by joining with other groups. It's a great clearinghouse for information, so I do encourage you to check out the website. All right. Can we go ahead and black the screen out? Actually, I'm going to start off with Nives here. So Nives, in your article in The Hill, you suggested that environmental groups and timber companies should work together to come up with some creative solutions. And I'm just kind of curious if you think that that's actually feasible. We've all heard about issues between foresters and environmental groups in terms of the spotted owl and other issues. Do you think that's feasible? Is there precedent for that?
This is absolutely feasible, and we've seen precedents in many environmental issues, including forestry. In forestry, we have two voluntary programs. One is Forestry FSI. Forgetting what FSI stands for, but that's not the one I want to talk about. That's the one that industry by itself wrote. And then there is a voluntary program in terms of determining how forest should be cut, how forest should be managed, and that is Sustainable Forest Initiative, SFI, which was developed with an environmental NGO and with the industry together. So we already have a precedent, and it's in the very same industry that we're talking about. So yes, absolutely, it can be done because it has been done. We also have examples in other areas such as sustainable fishing, sustainable aquaculture, and so on. But we definitely have it in forestry.
So this next question I think is for Brian. So Brian, we obviously in Western Washington in particular, we have a lot of managed forests, and we also have we have large national parks. And those things it's a mosaic. We have national parks and managed forests together. And I'm wondering if that complicates issues around wildfires and the management of those forests and what we do in case of wildfires. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, so the question about how different land management, I think, can you all hear me? I'll just keep this thing coupled on here really tight. The question about how different land management contexts interact with forest fires is a challenging one because it's very obvious with things like smoke, not knowing any borders, but even fires very often management boundaries. I'm just gonna give up on this microphone here. Drop the mic. And so, I mean, one thing that I think is helpful to think about with national parks versus national forests and fires is I often think of national parks not only as these awesome places that we get to go and visit and experience. I was just at Mount Rainier with my 3-year-old last weekend in the quasi-rain that was going on, and it was awesome. They're great places to experience, but they're also living natural laboratories for us to have our best understanding of how ecosystems are going to respond in the absence of very active, manipulative management. And that's a very different context, obviously, in national forests. There's a lot more different things that national forests are managed for. And so a lot of national parks are in a context where you can actually let fires burn. And while that is sometimes very societally challenging from a smoke production standpoint, it's oftentimes very much in tune with the ecological adaptations of a lot of the vegetation and animals in national parks. And so I do a lot of my work in national parks, actually, and I often think about them as some of our last remaining places on the planet for us to understand the natural dynamics of the ecosystems that we know and love by letting things like natural disturbances, like fire is one of, actually play their course and watch how the system responds without management to then inform how we would do more active management in other land contexts, such as private forests, other public forests, where there's a lot more in the equation of what we're managing for in these areas.
Well, okay, so that's really interesting. So jumping off of that, I'm wondering, did Smokey the Bear ruin me? Did it ruin us? I mean, as a communicator, do you think, and Heidi, this is for you too, we receive these messages about, us being able to prevent forest fires. Like forest fires are bad. I think most of us get this view as forest fires is bad. And so we got a question from the audience about, if fire is not bad, then why do we hear these messages about fires being severe and catastrophic? Is that just a messaging issue?
Well, let's tag team that one. I'll just segue in from what I was saying is I think one really important thing to recognize is that a fire can sometimes be societally catastrophic and societally very severe in how it affects humans, and actually ecologically sort of business as usual, and not anything that's going to threaten the integrity of that ecosystem. And in fact, a lot of the western U.S. is in that context. Even in sometimes what we think of as ecologically, look at this mega fire. It's crazy. The ecosystem is going to bounce back and perhaps be okay. But that's not the same thing as societally how we interact with that fire and the impacts of that fire. And so sometimes that mismatch can be a real struggle where the messaging gets lumped into one or the other. And it's often a lot more complex. So I don't know if you want to add to that.
Sure, from the human side. Or what are you, a robot? I don't know if you heard him, but under the breast, you can take that from the human side. Oh, coming near you here. So I think Smokey the Bear, unfortunately, one of his bigger problems is he's created a grammar spelling issue in society. Smokey the Bear is spelled with an EY. Smokey is spelled absent the E, just for those of you out there who are writing about smoky skies. Different. It's my favorite tweet this summer, a reporter who said, to all my reporter friends, Smokey the Bear is spelled with an E. Smoky skies do not have an E in them. Anyway, I love that. So in terms of Smokey the Bear himself, jokes aside, that's unfortunate. I think there's a conversation, an important conversation about communication it involves how we message about fire and our role in fire, but I think there's a really, really central issue, which is communication around how we respond to the impacts of fire. And we've been talking about smoke here tonight because that's a theme, right? But people are also, their lives can be threatened by wildfire, right? It's not just smoke. Smoke isn't the only consequence, right? You can, in Eastern Washington, they will tell you the smoke is often the least of their concerns. They're concerned about the fire licking flames at their rooftops, right? That is another important communication challenge, which is what do you do not only when the air you're breathing is of poor quality or unhealthy quality or extremely unhealthy quality, but is what do you do when there's a fire on your doorstep? And unfortunately, not everyone has equal access to that information for a variety of reasons, where the information is delivered, the channel upon which it's delivered, the language in which it's communicated. These are all really important things that I know that emergency managers in our state, forest managers, health practitioners, they're all thinking about how to do that. So I think this isn't in true spirit to the question, but I think there are, at the heart of how we communicate about wildfire, some really central questions about how do we make basic information accessible. I knew that the response from the Department of Health in Washington State was, in severe smoke conditions, close your windows. Purify your air if you can, preferably with a HEPA filter. If it's hot, somehow climate control your air. Most of us know that we don't have air conditioners, so that's like, out the door. I don't have that. But I could probably go buy one if I really needed to. And again, that is also an issue that starts to raise issues of equity and access. And not everyone has that information. I think there are intentional and really meaningful attempts at that, but there is needed conversation to continue to figure out how we do better, right? And that onus falls to me too. How do I communicate more effectively about future climate and what that means for wildfire, as well as a myriad of other climate impacts we expect to experience?
So there's two kinds of people who are worried about fire. Those who have their second homes in a beautiful ski resort, I don't care about those. The part that I do care about is those who have been pushed out of other areas and are looking for a cheaper place to build their home. Those I do care about. And those may simply need some help in moving to a place where they would be less concerned about fire. So I agree with Brian, forest will come back, humans, of course humans will come back as well, right? As a race we're resistant and resilient, but we as a society may need to find resources to help those who have been pushed into those fire-prone areas because of the high housing costs. Here I'm specifically talking California. We may have to find ways of helping them.
Clap for that. That's good. Especially the part about people's ski lodges. That's. So we got a question. We actually had a couple of questions for Nives because you brought up the issue of the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, and a couple of folks in the audience wanted to hear a little bit more about that and the trade-offs that go along with wildfire management and the ESA.
Thank you for the questions. Keep in mind I'm a social scientist, I'm not an ecologist. So my thinking about these issues is there going to be a conflict and how will we resolve the conflict and who will help us understand and resolve the conflict? I've been reading some work that has been coming out of Oregon Department of Natural Resources and Forest Management, and they are seeing relationship between having to preserve the environment for the Endangered Species Act and that leading to certain practices that keep the fuel, and on the other hand, those practices that keep the fuel increase the intensity and likelihood of fire. So that's what I've seen coming work out of Oregon. And as a political scientist, I'm thinking there's a conflict and we will have to resolve this conflict. And we will need environmental NGOs to help us understand what's at stake, and we'll have to have these conversations to tell those who enforce ESA for us that maybe we're willing to give up a little bit on the ESA side. I'm not saying that we are willing to, I'm saying we will have to have these conversations, and we may have to give a signal that it's okay to give in a little on the ESA side just to have less of a risk of forest fires.
Interesting. I'm kind of curious if you all have something to say about that, given Nives's comments. I can give you a second if you want.
Well, I would, I won't speak specifically to ESA, but I think, one of the points I was trying to make in some of the photographs that I was showing is that forest ecosystems are widely different, and even non-forest ecosystems, and the adaptations to fire are different in those systems. And so in some systems, trying to reduce catastrophic fire is going to be really a win-win for protecting human structures, safety, the integrity of the forest, and the native species in those forests. In other systems, that becomes a little bit decoupled in a lot of ways, and a lot of species are adapted to fire across the whole gradient of fire. And so I think as a society, one of the more challenging things is figuring out how to grapple with that, because as a human society, it's a little bit harder to say, okay, yeah, I'm gonna be adapted to really high severity fire when it comes. But the natural ecosystems have this sort of full menu of different adaptations that they have evolved over a really long time, where they've been living on a flammable planet, and so I think we're only going to come to have to grapple with that more and more when we think about one way to put it is the forests that we all know and love and identify so much with in places like the Pacific Northwest. Oftentimes we're born of fires that are really problematic for us as people, but are absolutely critical for a lot of the native ecosystems that we identify with and love to experience in different ways, and really kind of typify the region for a number of different ways.
And I'll just add, I echo what you say. As a human, I echo what you say.
Now from the human.
Yes. But I think an important element of that is that we know that we're changing those systems, right? We know that species are moving in response to a warming planet. We know that they're moving up in elevation and they're moving out of regions, seeking safer or those similar environments to which they're adapted. And we observe those systems in transition. And I think just circling back to one of the first questions, which was about National Park Service versus Forest Service lands and how we manage them. These conversations tend to be downers, so I'm going to just put a little hope bomb out there, which is that we are in a privileged place, which that it turns out every national forest in Oregon and Washington is considering how to incorporate climate change into its long-range planning, which has implications not for just us as humans, right? They don't just think about like what's best for humans. They actively think about and use science to say, well, what does the future bear for this forest? So the nuances that Brian has talked about that have been so informative, and I've learned a lot about, as a human, I've learned a lot from you today, Mr. Robot, about chaparral and ponderosa. Jokes aside. Right, those nuances matter, and it turns out there are people who are taking those nuances into consideration to figure out what's best. Not on a large scale, but in fact on small forest by forest scales, which is what we're, I think, in essence, arguing on the science side matters. Considering those nuances matters for how you manage forests for ecosystems and how you manage them to have the least negative consequences for us in a changing climate. What is less feasible is policies for every national forest, which Nives would point out is not possible nor effective, right? And so that's where the challenge comes into play between the earth scientists and, I don't know, what do you call yourself? Robot man? Tree robot. And our political savvy counterpart over here who tries to center us in reality. Right, there's this balance, and that balance is really important. But people are doing important things and having important conversations that take these nuances into consideration.
Very good. So, actually, I have a couple of questions. I have some questions that are more focused on the human side for the humans, and I have some forest type questions. Since you have the microphone in your hand, Heidi, this might be a question for you. One of our audience members asks if summer precipitation has changed in a meaningful way in Western Washington. Have we seen this occurring already? Have we seen meaningful changes in precipitation already? And is this sort of voting towards what we expect in the future?
Specifically, precipitation.
Precipitation.
Yes. Throwing the hard card. Precipitation is a really difficult variable. On an annual scale, so trends in precipitation themselves are difficult for a variety of reasons. Look at me being a scientist who's wavering here. But so when we think about trends in precipitation, this is a perfect plug. So the Office of the Washington State Climatologist just published last week a brand new online data visualization of all the weather stations in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, and you can station by station click and look at both temperature trends and precipitation trends. So I'm not going to pretend that I have all of those thousands and thousands of data points in my head, but I think the main, you can go look for yourselves, and I'm happy to give you the URL for that website. You can look at those trends station by station, but also in relation to statewide averages or regional averages. But it's the seasonal changes in precipitation that really matter as we look towards the future. So we expect summer precipitation, which in the context of this conversation about forests and wildfire is the season that matters, and we do expect precipitation, slight decreases in precipitation in the future in the summer. So I'm happy to talk to you about the nuances of precipitation as a variable, but yes, the answer is yes, we expect to see less precipitation, and depending on where you're asking about, even in Western Washington, we could talk about the trends in precipitation offline, but I don't know if Brian, you have something you'd like to add? Yeah.
Great. Very good. Okay, so this question maybe is for Nives. Audience asks, we all have limited time, obviously. We want to get the most bang for our buck.
I get the hint. I get the hint.
You get the hint. All right. No. Oh, gosh. You're too quick for me. She's too quick for me. You can take all the time you want on this question. So the question is local, state, or federal policy the most important to focus on if we were going to choose a place to take action?
Very good question. And to be honest and true to my training and to a person who probably invented the word polycentricity, which was Elinor Ostrom, I would say all of them are important. And the reason that all of them are important is that forests are owned by different entities. Definitely federal policy has to be there for forests that are owned by the federal government. State policy has to be there for forests that are owned by a state. Local policy has to be there for private forest owners. And maybe it's not just the governments, maybe again it's us as consumers saying, from now on when I'm buying forest and paper products, I will make sure that I always buy SFI certified, because I know that those are the best practices that environmental NGOs and the industry together have developed. So again, yes, governments are extremely important, but I would like to remind us all that we as consumers also have a say, and it's SFI. Sustainable Forestry Initiative. There's a seal on every product that's either of wood or of paper if it is SFI certified, so we can vote with our dollars as well.
That was very concise.
Can I add something?
Yeah, you have less time though.
Okay. My quick spiel, I think, and you can disagree with me, I think putting your efforts into political action at any level matter. Being an engaged citizen matters, right? That's a privilege. And I think that importantly, when we are developing sound, smart policies, even if they are not necessarily at the federal scale, other states and other regions and other decision makers look to leaders in the field to figure out how to craft smart policies and policies that win. And so sometimes the size doesn't really matter because there are eyes and ears, and we live in a world where information is shared widely. And so even small efforts or policies that may seem small, there are people looking for leaders, and leaders will be the ones that champion change, not just in one state or in one community, but that can scale up to national and global policy as well.
Great. Well, since you brought up during your presentations, actually I think many of you did, this idea that from the human dimension, we're going to be impacted in different ways. Different communities are going to be impacted in different ways. And we had a question from one of our audience members about our community that lives outside. So we have quite a few people who live outdoors in Seattle. And this, what can be done to protect that community of people? And is there advice or guidance that can be provided to cities on how to protect that community?
I'm not aware of policies that we have in Seattle. There are cities that have severe air pollution. There are cities on the northeast side of the United States that have severe air pollution. So we could look for best practices there. The least what we should be able to offer as a society is some sort of temporary shelter, because if we're telling everyone who's older and has any kind of health restrictions or limitations, do not be outdoors, we should definitely help those who permanently, or at least for a longer period, live outdoors. Again, I think we need to come up with some temporary shelter for that 1 week, 2 weeks when we're facing this situation. Don't ask me how we'll pay for it, but I think we should do it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. We obviously need to pay for that, and we need to make facilities accessible, and I think that extends not only, importantly to populations who live outdoors, but to populations who also don't necessarily have access to information or resources that allow them to respond in a way that reduces the negative health consequences for individuals, right? There are individuals who are prone, who are already limited in their access to healthcare, or don't know or don't have close proximal access to facilities that offer, say, cool air or filtered air, and this extends into impacts like extreme heat. What do you do? Where do you go? And I think, for some of us, that's a question we ask that maybe isn't so pressing, but making sure, A, those facilities exist is a huge step in the right direction, and that those who need those facilities know that they're available and that they remain available.
Not everybody has in-laws that they can go to.
That they want to be stuck with.
Well, yeah. So, Brian, I think you mentioned the idea previously. You were talking about, obviously you were talking about forest management in many different areas, and one of the questions we had is whether or not we might expect larger, more intense forest fires in western Washington, like we've seen elsewhere.
Yeah, so I think on the west side of the Cascades, it's easy for us to not think of fire as a problem that we are encountered with in the same way that folks on the east side of the Cascades in the warmer, drier part of the state experience fire. If you look at a map of fire since the mid-1980s, when we have good satellite data of fire perimeters, it's unbelievable. If you look at the Cascade crest, it's all on the east side, and there's little tiny blips on the west side of the Cascades. And that can lead to a little bit of a sense of, it's not a problem that we need to worry about in our backyards on this side of the Cascades. However, kind of building on what I was saying before, a lot of the forests that we know and love on the west side of the Cascades were born following big fires of yesteryear. And if you sort of backed that timeline up and looked at a map of fire occurrence in Washington, you'd see that in the past, during warmer and drier periods, there were very large and very severe fires that really are characteristic of a lot of the forests in the sort of Douglas fir zone that we think of that characterizes the west side of the state, and much of it. Those forests, again, are fairly well adapted to those kind of events happening on that long sort of boom and bust cycle. But the recent history of that is not sort of seared into our minds in the same way that it is in eastern Washington in the last several decades. However, going back to the earlier parts of the 1900s, there were big fires of several 100,000 acres that occurred on the west side of the Cascades. The Tillamook burn in Oregon, the Yakult burn in southern Washington, that you almost wouldn't recognize today because, again, 100 years later, the forests have grown back. So it is reasonable to assume that continued warming and drying, and an increase in the sorts of conditions that are conducive to those fires happening is going to bring a greater probability of fire on the west side. And in fact, the research that has looked into that, this is not research that I've done, but other folks affiliated with agencies and universities in the region suggests that we're going to be seeing a doubling or tripling of area burned on the west side of the Cascades, depending on where you are, relative to what we've seen in the last 100 years or so. And so, again, it's important for us to kind of have that in the back of our mind, that fire has played a very big role in structuring these forests on the west side, but in a very different way than the frequent fire, sort of low severity fire historically played on the east side of the Cascades. It is a boom and bust system, ecologically speaking, on the west side of the Cascades. And so we've been in a little bit of a bust period in the last several decades, but we're starting to see conditions that are very likely going to increase the probability of big fire potential on the west side of the Cascades.
Interesting. I'm going to go with this next question because the person wrote it in all caps with exclamation points. So it's a very important question for someone. For the robot. It says, please ask this of the robot. Is there any sort of connection between climate change and the spread of invasive species in forests, such as the pine bark beetle?
An all caps question. I'll give an all caps answer. Yeah, here we go. So, actually, that's one of the main misunderstandings, I think, that I hear a lot about the mountain pine beetle outbreak and other insect outbreaks in forests. Much like fire, most of the sort of big beetle outbreaks that we think of, mountain pine beetle, spruce beetle, Douglas fir beetle, the ones that have really impacted forests on the western half of the U.S., most of those are native species and actually play a very important role in also maintaining the structure and function of those forests. So that part I think is important to understand, that we wouldn't want to get rid of insects like mountain pine beetles in forests the same way that we probably wouldn't want to get rid of fire unless we're ready to make a decision to make sort of wholesale changes to how these ecosystems operate, because they're very integral parts of those ecosystems and are native organisms that have been there for millennia, and the trees as well as other organisms have adapted to those things. However, the answer to should we expect more of those in the future is in some ways similar to the question of should we expect more fire in the future, and that warm temperatures and dry conditions are conditions that are one key ingredient to things like insect outbreaks, for different reasons than fire, but it's also a key ingredient to fire. And one of those key things is that those warm temperatures have an impact on the population cycle of those beetles and can actually speed up the population growth of those beetles, as well at the same time stressing the trees during warm, dry, drought conditions. And so you sort of have two key pieces that lead to those beetle outbreaks. One thing I will say with beetle outbreaks is there's also a lot of what we call negative feedbacks built into the cycle. So not negative in a value-laden way, but in terms of if you have a beetle outbreak this year in a forest, you have a low likelihood of having that next year in the forest, because the beetle outbreak can only happen so long as that there are large, live, susceptible trees of their host species. And so a lot of the areas that you see in the western, blanketing western North America that have had really severe beetle outbreaks in recent decades are actually not likely to have those same beetle outbreaks for quite a while until that forest sort of regains the condition of large host trees that are available and then stressed in the future. And so that warming condition could lead to continual stress of those trees in the future. But there are also really key feedbacks between the beetles and what they eat, which is the trees. And so once they've eaten all the trees that they can attack, they don't have as much of that resource available to them, and so their populations then crash. So kind of interesting, but certainly climate is one key ingredient in that disturbance as well.
Interesting. Well, y'all, we have a lot of note cards in here, a lot of questions, but I definitely want to give you all a chance to talk with the audience directly. And I just have one big sort of overarching philosophical question that was It was actually suggested by the human on the panel. But what do you? we'll make Brian go first though. What is it that you wish for out of an event like this? When we have these conversations about issues like this, what do you wish for the future?
I'm gonna step outside of my robot phase here and big picture. I really wish that we can have healthy societal dialogue where we're having discussions about this that are informed by the best available science as one piece of the decision-making process, and that is a foundation upon which we can have these discussions. And so, I think it's a brave new world that we're entering, where precisely predicting what that world might look like and what might actually be possible in terms of kind of the social ecological environment that we look in, that we're looking to. We have a lot of ability to shape that future, and I just hope that we can have healthy dialogue about that, where science is one key piece of information that's at the table when those discussions are being made. How's that for a robot answer?
You stole my human answer. Just like a robot would. You were coded to do that. No, I think, why did I ask you to ask this question?
I thought you already had an answer.
I thought
it was a softball I was going to toss for you.
No, I mean, I think we've discussed a lot of dimensions of one of the many impacts of climate, and climate is one of the many concerns that exists in society, and it's not necessarily the first and foremost concern, right? There are a lot of other things that happen in the world. I happen to spend my days mired in climate. We call it the gray cloud of doom, right? And half jokingly. And I think that climate being part of the conversation, and that science is part of and a central part of the decision making and the dialogue around climate would be great. But I think it's also about how we make that conversation more inclusive. And informed dialogue also requires authentic listening and genuine engagement. And I think crafting and coming up with inclusive policies or solutions requires that we make ourselves uncomfortable and have conversations, and difficult conversations, with people who experience and view the world differently than we do. And that's a challenge that I embrace every day. We were talking about this in our office today, actually. We have these climate and communications coffee chats, right? And where we talk about the challenges that we face in communicating and how we might do it better and what are the concerns. And I think what I would like is for myself and for us all is to engage in that dialogue, but maybe engage in places where it's not so familiar and so comfortable, but we do that with open hearts and open minds, with the real intention of trying to come up with solutions that are actionable and that matter and that have an impact.
How much time do we have for all the wishes? I wish that all the people who are sitting here continue doing what we're doing, and that is meeting and making decisions both with our heart and with our reason, rather than along the political party lines. Environmental decisions are too important, but have unfortunately become ideological and political divider. And I wish that we would stop doing this in the United States, and again, that we would make decisions with our heart and with the reason, rather than with the political party that we vote for. So that's my first wish. I just have two. And the second wish is that we put the right people into the government, so that the government creates the incentives that guide the right decisions. So that those of us who do protect the environment don't feel that we are, this is the technical term from from my literature. It's called the sucker. So that those of us who are, all of us here, who are doing the right thing, and that is what's environmentally responsible, that we finally have governments who recognize this and create incentives that recognize what we're doing, or at least make those who don't do what's right pay for it. Those are my 2 wishes.
Well, those are great wishes. Yeah. So thank you all for your, I want to thank the whole panel here for all that they've had to say. So you can go ahead and clap for them. But wait, there's more. We want to go ahead and invite you all to ask your questions. If we didn't get around to your questions, we want to invite you to ask your questions directly of the scientists.